My name is Eleanor, and I am 42 years old. The day I discovered I'd won $73 million in the Powerball lottery was the same day I realized my entire family had been slowly poisoning my life for 15 years, and I decided to do absolutely nothing except watch them destroy themselves while pretending to be broke. Before we dive into the secret I've carried for all these years, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and drop a comment below guessing what the final twist will be. Now, where were we? I remember standing in the convenience store on Porter Street, holding that ticket in my trembling hands, staring at the numbers that matched perfectly across the screen behind the counter. 6 numbers. 6 little circles that represented more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. The clerk was asking me if I was okay because I'd gone completely pale, and I told her I was fine, just forgot my wallet, and I walked out of that store with my winning ticket folded inside my jacket pocket. I didn't cash it that day. I didn't cash it for 3 weeks. Because the moment I saw those numbers, the moment I understood what had just happened, a memory crashed into my mind with such force that I had to sit down on the curb outside that store and just breathe. It was a memory from 18 months earlier of my sister Victoria sitting at my kitchen table, coffee cup in her hand, telling me with tears streaming down her face that she needed to borrow $20,000 for her daughter's surgery, and I had given her everything I had in my savings account, every single penny I'd scraped together from my job as a medical transcriptionist, and she had hugged me and called me her hero and promised she'd pay me back within 6 months. Except there had never been any surgery. I found that out by accident when I ran into Victoria's daughter, my niece Emma, at the mall 3 months later, and she was perfectly healthy, laughing with her friends, and when I carefully asked about her recovery, she looked at me confused and said recovery from what? And the truth started cracking open like an egg. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to where this whole nightmare really started, because you need to understand what my family was, what they did, and why what I did next was the only thing that made sense. I grew up as the middle child in a family of 5, sandwiched between my older sister Victoria, who was beautiful and charming and could convince anyone to do anything, and my younger brother Marcus, who was the golden boy, the athlete, the one with potential. My parents, Richard and Claire Montgomery, ran a modest accounting firm in Cleveland, and we lived a comfortable middle-class life in a 3-bedroom house with a backyard and a golden retriever named Biscuit. On the surface, we were the picture of American normalcy. But underneath, in the spaces between Sunday dinners and birthday parties, there was something else, something I didn't have words for until much later in life. I was the responsible one. I was the one who cleaned up messes, who mediated fights, who sacrificed and saved and never asked for anything. Victoria got the attention because she was stunning and dramatic. Marcus got the investment because he might be somebody someday, and I got the responsibility of holding everything together. When I was 19, I took out student loans to put myself through community college for medical transcription while living at home and working nights at a diner. And during that same time, my parents paid for Victoria's wedding, a $25,000 affair with a live band and imported flowers, and they co-signed a car loan for Marcus so he could have reliable transportation to his college football practices. When I asked if they could help me with even a semester of tuition, my father looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "Eleanor, you've always been self-sufficient. We know you can handle this on your own." And that was that. I moved out when I was 23, got my own apartment, worked my way up to a better position, and I thought I'd finally escape that dynamic. But family is a spider web, and once you're born into it, those threads follow you everywhere. Victoria got divorced at 27, and suddenly she was at my door 3 nights a week, crying, drinking my wine, sleeping on my couch, and I let her because that's what you do for family. Marcus dropped out of college after a knee injury ended his football dreams, and he moved back in with our parents, depressed and directionless, and when they asked me to talk to him, to help motivate him, I did, spending hours on the phone encouraging him, sending him job listings, connecting him with people in my network. I got him an interview at the hospital where I worked, and he got the job in the IT department, and my parents thanked me by taking him out to a celebratory dinner and forgetting to invite me. These weren't big betrayals. They were paper cuts, tiny wounds that individually meant nothing but together. Over years and years, they bled me dry. Then came the incident with the money I mentioned, Victoria's fake surgery fund. When I discovered the truth, When Emma told me she had no idea what I was talking about, I did what any rational person would do when I confronted Victoria. I called her, asked her to meet me for lunch, and I laid it out calmly. I said I knew there had been no surgery, I knew she'd lied, and I needed to know what the $20,000 had actually been for. She didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. She stirred her iced tea and told me she'd needed it for credit card debt, that she was drowning and didn't know what else to do, and she knew I wouldn't give her money for that reason, so she'd made up the surgery story. I sat there, my sandwich untouched, and I asked her when she planned to pay me back, and she laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but worse, a dismissive one, the kind that says, "Oh, Eleanor, always so uptight about money." She said she'd pay me back when she could, but things were tight, and surely I understood that family helps family without keeping score. I told her we were done, that I needed that money and she'd stolen it from me through lies, and she called me selfish and stormed out of the restaurant, and somehow, within 48 hours, I was the villain of the family. My mother called me and said she was disappointed in me for holding money over Victoria's head during such a difficult time in her life. Marcus sent me a text saying I always had to make everything about me. My father didn't call at all. I realized then, sitting alone in my apartment on a Friday night with a glass of cheap wine and the crushing weight of being misunderstood, that my family had cast me in a role a long time ago, and nothing I did would ever change it. I was the resource, the solution, the stable one who could take the hit, and if I ever pushed back, if I ever said no or demanded fairness, I became the problem. So I stopped pushing back. I went quiet. I still showed up for holidays, still answered calls, but I built a wall inside myself, and I promised I would never let them take anything from me again. That promise lasted exactly 9 months, until my mother called me in tears saying they were going to lose the house because the accounting firm was failing, and they needed $35,000 to avoid foreclosure, and they had nowhere else to turn. I was still recovering financially from Victoria's theft, but when your mother is crying and your childhood home is at stake, what do? I took out a personal loan at a devastating interest rate. I gave them the money, and they promised this time was different. This time they'd pay me back with interest as soon as the firm recovered. It was 3 weeks after I gave them that money, 3 weeks after I'd committed myself to years of debt, that I bought the lottery ticket. I bought it at the same convenience store where I always stopped for coffee on my way to work, and I picked numbers that meant nothing to me because I'd long since stopped believing in luck or fate or any kind of cosmic justice. I picked numbers at random, paid my $2, shoved the ticket in my purse, and forgot about it. The drawing was on a Saturday night, and I was at home in my pajamas watching a documentary about scam artists, which in retrospect is almost funny, and my phone buzzed with a news alert that someone in Ohio had won the Powerball jackpot, $73 million. And I felt that little flutter of fantasy everyone feels, imagining what if, before going back to my documentary. I found the ticket on Monday morning when I was cleaning out my purse, and I checked the numbers on my phone while standing in my kitchen, and I had to check 3 times before my brain would accept what my eyes were seeing. I won. I had won. $73 million. Even after taxes, it would be somewhere around $48 million. $48 million. I couldn't breathe. I sat down on my kitchen floor, and I started laughing, and then I started crying, and then I just sat there in silence for almost an hour, holding this piece of paper that represented total freedom. And then, like I said, I thought about Victoria and the fake surgery and my parents and the business loan and Marcus and every single time I'd been used and dismissed and blamed, and I made a decision. I decided not to tell anyone. I decided to hide the money, to keep working my regular job, to keep living in my apartment, to watch and wait and see what would happen, and what happened was worse than I could have imagined. The first thing I did was consult with a lawyer, a lottery lawyer I found through careful research in a city 2 hours away where no one knew me. I told him I needed complete anonymity, and he explained the process for claiming through a trust, how I could structure everything so my name never appeared publicly, and I did exactly that. I set up a blind trust with a name that meant nothing, the Clearwater Family Trust, and I claimed my prize through the trust with my lawyer as the trustee of record. The money was deposited into accounts I controlled, but on paper, I was invisible. It took 6 weeks to finalize everything, 6 weeks during which I went to work every day, came home to my modest apartment, and acted like nothing had changed. But I also did something else during those 6 weeks. I started paying attention, really paying attention, to my family, and what I discovered made me physically ill. I started with Victoria because she was the most obvious. I created a fake social media profile, generic enough to be invisible, and I followed her accounts and her friends' accounts, and I scrolled back through months of posts. Victoria, who told me she was drowning in debt and desperately struggling, had taken a trip to Miami 3 months after I gave her the $20,000. I found photos of her on a yacht, holding champagne, wearing designer sunglasses, tagged at expensive restaurants. I found receipts in the comments from her friends saying things like, "So jealous of your life, and you deserve this vacation, queen." The surgery money had funded a party trip. I sat at my computer, staring at these photos, and I felt something crack inside my chest. But I kept digging. I looked at Marcus next, and I found posts from around the same time showing off a new gaming setup, a high-end computer with multiple monitors and expensive accessories, and his friends commenting about how insane his rig was. I remembered he called me around that time asking to borrow $500 for rent, and I'd sent it immediately, and now I was looking at a photo of him holding a graphics card that cost twice that much. But the worst discovery, the one that nearly broke me, came when I decided to investigate my parents' business situation. I told myself I was being paranoid, that surely the business loan was legitimate, surely they wouldn't lie about losing their home, but I couldn't stop the suspicion now that it had taken root. I drove past their house one evening after work, and I saw my father in the driveway washing a car I didn't recognize, a new SUV with temporary plates. I felt sick. I went home and I did something I'm not proud of. I used information I still had from years ago when I'd helped them with some filing to access their business account portal, and I looked at the statements, and what I found was that the business was fine. Not thriving, but stable, making modest profits, paying its bills. There had been no impending foreclosure. There had been no financial crisis. The $35,000 I'd borrowed at 15% interest, the money that would take me years to pay off, had been a lie. I saw the deposit of my money into their account, and then 2 weeks later, I saw a large withdrawal and a payment to a luxury travel agency. They'd taken a 20-day cruise to Alaska, a cruise I'd financed with my debt while believing I was saving their home. I sat at my computer, looking at these bank statements that I'd accessed through legally questionable means, and I understood something fundamental about my existence. My family didn't love me the way I loved them. They didn't see me as a person with needs and dreams and limits. They saw me as an ATM, a resource to be tapped whenever they wanted something, and when the well ran dry, they simply lied to prime the pump again. And the most crushing part was knowing that if I confronted them, if I showed them this evidence and demanded accountability, I would still be the villain. I would be the one invading their privacy, the one making accusations, the one tearing the family apart over money. The system was rigged, and I had always been designed to lose. That's when the plan started forming. I had $48 million that no one knew about. I had the ultimate power in this situation, the power of information asymmetry, and I decided to use it. Not for revenge exactly, or at least that's what I told myself at first, but for truth. I wanted to see who they really were when they thought I had nothing. I wanted to watch them without the mask of desperation I usually wore, the mask that made them think they could do anything to me because I was desperate for their love and approval. I wanted to see my family without that filter, and then I wanted them to see themselves. So I became a ghost in my own life. I kept working at the hospital, kept living in my apartment, kept driving my 12-year-old Honda Civic, but behind the scenes, I was building something. I hired a private investigator, a professional who specialized in family cases, and I had him document everything. Every lie, every manipulation, every time one of them claimed poverty while living beyond their means. I collected evidence the way a prosecutor builds a case, and I waited. I also started testing them, little experiments to see how far they'd go. I called Victoria and told her I'd been laid off from work and was really struggling, just to see what she'd say, and she barely paused before asking if I could watch her kids for free the following weekend because she had a spa day planned. I told Marcus I was thinking about selling my car because I couldn't afford the insurance anymore, and he asked if he could have first dibs on buying it cheap. I mentioned to my parents that I was eating rice and beans to save money, and my mother said that's nice, dear, and then spent 20 minutes telling me about the new furniture they were buying for the living room. The months passed like this, with me playing the role of struggling Eleanor while my bank accounts grew with smart investments and interest, and my family revealed themselves in small, ugly ways. But I needed something bigger. I needed the moment that would justify what I was planning, the undeniable proof that would make everything clear. That moment came on my 42nd birthday. I didn't expect anything elaborate, but I'd hoped for dinner, maybe a cake, some acknowledgement. Instead, I got a text from my mother saying they'd forgotten, and could we reschedule? And when I said of course, trying not to sound hurt, she sent back a smiley face emoji and nothing else. Victoria didn't reach out at all. Marcus sent a GIF that said happy birthday with no personal message. I sat alone in my apartment with a grocery store cupcake, and I cried. And then I stopped crying and I made a phone call. I called my mother the next day and I lied. I told her I'd been diagnosed with a serious medical condition, that I needed surgery, that my insurance wouldn't cover it all, and I was terrified. I told her I needed $20,000, and I didn't know where else to turn. I made my voice shake. I let myself cry real tears, tears for all the years of being invisible, and I waited to see what she would say. There was a long pause, and then my mother said, "Eleanor, honey, I wish we could help, but we just don't have that kind of money right now. Things are very tight." I asked about the cruise, about the new furniture, about the SUV, and she got defensive and said those were necessary expenses, and it was unfair of me to question their finances, and besides, I was always so capable and strong. Surely I could figure something out. She suggested I start a GoFundMe. My own mother suggested I beg strangers on the internet for medical money while she planned her next vacation. That phone call was the final piece. I had everything I needed. The evidence, the witnesses, the documentation, and most importantly, the moral clarity. I wasn't destroying my family out of spite. I was holding up a mirror and making them look at their own reflection, and if they didn't like what they saw, that wasn't my fault. I spent the next 3 months putting the final pieces in place, and then I set a date. I decided it would happen at Christmas, at the annual family gathering that my parents hosted every year, the one sacred tradition where everyone was required to show up and pretend we were a happy, functional family. It was perfect. Everyone would be there. Everyone would be comfortable and off guard, and I would finally tell the truth. But here's the thing about plans, even careful plans built on months of preparation. Sometimes the universe has its own plans, and sometimes those plans are even more devastating than anything you imagined. 2 weeks before Christmas, I got a call from Emma, Victoria's daughter, my niece. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her, and when she finally calmed down enough to speak, she told me something that changed everything. She told me that Victoria had cancer. Real cancer this time, stage 3 ovarian cancer, and she just started chemotherapy, and she was terrified. Emma said Victoria didn't want anyone to know, especially not me, because she was ashamed about lying about the surgery before, and she didn't think I'd believe her this time. And Emma was calling because she didn't know what else to do, and she knew I'd always been the strong one in the family. I hung up the phone, and I felt the floor drop out from underneath me. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be the twist. I'd spent months preparing to destroy Victoria, to expose her as a liar and a thief, and now she was actually sick, actually dying possibly, and if I went ahead with my plan, I'd be the monster who attacked a cancer patient. I sat down and I tried to think, tried to figure out what to do with this information, and then I realized something. Emma had said Victoria didn't want me to know. Emma had called without Victoria's permission, which meant Victoria was still hiding, still lying by omission, still taking money from me through our parents without telling me she was actually in crisis. Even now, even sick, she couldn't be honest with me. And that's when I understood that my plan wasn't wrong, it was incomplete. I needed to adjust, to account for this complication, because the truth was still the truth, even when it was complicated. I called Emma back and I told her I'd help, but I needed to do it my way, and I needed her to trust me. She agreed, desperate for any support, and I started the next phase. I reached out to Victoria directly, breaking months of minimal contact, and I told her Emma had told me everything and I wanted to help. Victoria was defensive at first, embarrassed, but I was gentle, I was kind. I was the sister I'd always been, and she broke down and admitted everything. The diagnosis, the treatment, the fear, the money problems because chemotherapy wasn't cheap even with insurance. She told me she'd been trying to handle it alone because she didn't want to burden anyone, And I told her she didn't have to be alone, and I offered to pay for a treatment she'd been considering, an experimental therapy that might improve her odds but cost $30,000 out of pocket. I told her I'd taken out another loan, that I was going into deeper debt, but she was my sister and I loved her and I'd do anything for her. Victoria cried and thanked me and called me her angel, and I wired her the money within 24 hours, and she had no idea that I had $47 million in accounts she couldn't see. But here's what Victoria also didn't know. I'd done my research on her cancer, on her specific diagnosis and stage and treatment plan, and I discovered something interesting. The experimental therapy she wanted, the one that cost $30,000, wasn't actually experimental. It was a standard treatment that was covered by her insurance, but there was a clinic in Mexico that offered the same treatment as a luxury package with concierge services and beachside recovery, and that's what she wanted the money for. She was using her real cancer to scam me for a luxury medical vacation. Emma didn't know this. Emma thought her mother was desperately seeking life-saving treatment. But I knew, because I'd hired that investigator to check, and he'd found the brochures in Victoria's trash, the correspondence with the Mexican clinic, the whole truth. So I gave her the money, and I watched her book the trip, and I documented everything, and I added it to my file, and I moved forward with my plan with a few modifications. Christmas came, and we all gathered at my parents' house like we did every year. The tree was up, lights twinkling, the smell of pine and cinnamon in the air, and everyone was in good spirits because Victoria had just gotten back from her treatment and was telling everyone how hopeful she felt. I watched her laughing, glowing with her Mexican spa tan, wearing a new outfit she bought down there, and I felt nothing but a cold, clear certainty. I waited until dinner was over, until we were all sitting in the living room with our coffee and dessert, and then I stood up and said I had an announcement to make. I told them I'd won the lottery. I told them I'd won $73 million almost a year ago, and I'd been living with that secret while watching all of them, and everything I'd learned had broken my heart. The room went silent. Marcus laughed, thinking it was a joke, but my father saw my face and he knew it wasn't. Victoria went pale. I reached into my bag and I pulled out a folder, a thick folder full of papers, and I started laying out the evidence. The bank statements showing their business was fine when they'd claimed crisis. The social media posts showing Victoria's Miami trip funded by fake surgery money. The receipts and records of every lie, every manipulation, every time they'd taken from me while I was struggling. I showed them the investigators' report on Victoria's Mexican spa treatment masquerading as experimental cancer therapy. I showed them transcripts of conversations where they discussed how easy it was to get money from me because I was desperate for their approval. The investigator had gotten those through Victoria's own daughter, who recorded her mother on the phone with my mother, laughing about how I'd fallen for the medical loan story again. Emma was sitting in the corner, crying, because she thought she was helping me gather evidence to support her mother's real health crisis, and instead she'd helped me expose a lie wrapped in a real diagnosis. The room exploded. Victoria screamed at me, called me a monster for using a cancer patient's fear against them. My mother stood up and said I'd violated their privacy, that what I'd done was illegal and cruel. Marcus tried to grab the papers from me, saying I was trying to tear the family apart. My father just sat there, staring at the bank statements with his business's name on them, saying nothing. I waited for them to finish yelling, and then I spoke, and my voice was steady and cold and clear. I told them that everything in that folder was true, that they'd used me as a resource for years without care or conscience, that they'd lied and stolen and manipulated, and now they were angry because they'd been caught. I told them that Victoria did have cancer, and I wasn't diminishing that, but she'd chosen to use her diagnosis as a weapon to scam me for luxury instead of being honest about her actual needs, which I would have helped with gladly. I told them that I'd given Victoria money for real treatment the moment I knew the truth, but she'd chosen to lie again, and that pattern was what I was exposing. Then I told them about the money, all of it. I explained that I'd won $48 million after taxes, that I'd been financially secure for almost a year, that every time they'd lied to me or used me, I'd had the power to cut them off, but I'd chosen to keep giving them rope to hang themselves with. I told them I'd paid for Victoria's fake Mexico trip with pocket change from my investment dividends, that the loan I claimed to have taken out didn't exist, that every sob story I'd told them in recent months was a test they'd failed spectacularly. And then I told them what came next. I told them I'd set up a fund for Emma's education, $200,000 in a trust she'd get when she turned 21, because she was innocent in all of this and deserved better than to learn manipulation from her mother. I told them I'd paid off the loan I'd actually taken out to save their fake business crisis, so they couldn't claim I'd somehow trapped them in debt. And then I told them that every single cent they'd ever taken from me through lies, every dollar, was going to be paid back, not to me but to charity, and I'd be sending them monthly statements showing the donations made in their names to causes that helped people who were genuinely struggling, unlike them. Victoria lunged at me, actually physically tried to attack me, and Marcus held her back while she screamed that I'd killed her, that the stress would make her cancer worse, that I was murdering my own sister. My mother was crying, saying I'd destroyed the family over money, that I was selfish and cruel, and she didn't know who I was anymore. My father finally spoke, and all he said was, "You should have told us. We could have talked about this." And I almost laughed at the delusion. I picked up my folder, and I walked toward the door, and then Victoria said something that made me stop. She said, "You think you're so smart, you think you've won, but you're going to die alone, Eleanor. You're going to die alone and bitter, and no one's going to care, and you'll deserve it." I turned around and I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw a woman who'd built her entire life on using other people, who'd weaponized everything including her own illness, who genuinely believed she was the victim in this scenario. And I looked at my parents, who'd raised us in a system where love was conditional and resources were allocated based on charm and manipulation rather than need or fairness. And I looked at Marcus, who'd learned from the best and had never once thought about who paid the cost for his comfort. And I realized that Victoria was right about one thing. I might die alone, but I'd die free, and they'd die trapped in a web of their own making, forever wondering who was real and who was just playing an angle, forever guarding their resources against the people they taught to take. I told her thank you for finally being honest about something, and I walked out of that house for the last time. The aftermath was predictable and somehow still shocking. Victoria tried to sue me for emotional distress, claiming my revelation had worsened her medical condition, but her lawyer dropped the case when my lawyer presented evidence of her fraud. My parents stopped speaking to me entirely, and then 3 months later, my father called and asked if we could talk. And when I agreed to meet him, he spent 2 hours trying to explain that they'd always loved me, but I'd never needed them the way the others did. And couldn't I see that their lies came from a place of not wanting to burden me further? And I sat there listening to this man rewrite history in real time, and I said, "No, Dad, your lies came from entitlement and laziness. You could have asked me honestly, and I would have helped, but you chose to manipulate instead, and that's on you." He left angry, and I haven't heard from him since. Marcus sent me a long email months later, apologizing and explaining that he'd been in therapy and was starting to understand the family dynamics that had shaped us all. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, but he wanted me to know he was trying to be better. I wrote back and told him I appreciated the effort, and if he proved through his actions over years that he genuinely changed, maybe we could rebuild something, but words without actions were just more manipulation. Victoria never apologized. She recovered from her cancer treatment, the real treatment this time paid for by her insurance, and she moved to Arizona with Emma to start over, and Emma sends me messages sometimes, thanking me for the education fund and telling me about her life. And through her I know that Victoria tells people I'm dead, that it's easier than explaining what really happened. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming, the part that changed everything I thought I understood about this story. 6 months after the Christmas revelation, I got a letter in the mail from a lawyer I didn't recognize, representing an estate I'd never heard of. The letter informed me that a woman named Dorothy Brennan had passed away and had left me something in her will. I had no idea who Dorothy Brennan was. I called the lawyer, confused, and he asked me to come to his office, said it was better to explain in person. I went, and he showed me a file, and inside that file was a photograph of a woman in her 70s with eyes that looked exactly like mine. Dorothy Brennan was my biological grandmother, my mother's mother, who I'd been told died before I was born. Except she hadn't died. She'd been cut off from the family when my mother was 16, cut off for reasons that became clear as the lawyer explained. Dorothy had been wealthy, the heir to a manufacturing fortune, and when my mother was a teenager, Dorothy had discovered that my mother was stealing from her, manipulating her, using her money to fund a lifestyle built on lies. Dorothy had cut my mother off completely, written her out of the will, and told her she'd get nothing until she learned to live honestly. My mother had responded by telling everyone Dorothy was dead, and she'd raised us believing that lie. Dorothy had watched from a distance through investigators, had known about me and Victoria and Marcus, had seen the family patterns repeat, and when she read about the Clearwater Family Trust lottery winner in Ohio, she'd had her investigator dig deeper, and she'd figured out it was me. She'd spent the last months of her life writing me a letter, which the lawyer handed me now. In the letter, Dorothy told me her story, told me about watching my mother become the person she was and feeling helpless to stop it, told me about the guilt she carried for not fighting harder to stay in our lives, for not trying to save us from the pattern she'd established. She told me she'd followed my life as best she could from afar, and she wanted me to know that I wasn't crazy, that my perceptions were correct, that the family system was designed to use me and I didn't owe them anything. She told me about the lottery win, said she recognized my strategy of hiding and watching, said she understood the impulse toward revenge because she'd felt it herself. And then she told me something that made me cry in that lawyer's office, surrounded by strangers' furniture and the smell of old law books. She told me that revenge never made her feel better, that cutting off my mother had been necessary for her own survival but it hadn't healed the wound, and she'd spent 40 years wealthy and safe and still sad, and she didn't want that for me. She told me to use the money not for revenge, but for building something new, for creating the family I deserved rather than destroying the family I was born into. And then the lawyer told me the rest. Dorothy had left me her entire estate, another $12 million, because she said I was the only grandchild who'd broken the pattern, who'd seen the truth and survived it. She'd left my mother nothing, left Victoria and Marcus nothing, but she'd established a fund that would pay for genuine medical expenses or educational costs if any of them ever needed it, administered by trustees who would verify every claim. She'd found a way to offer safety without enabling manipulation, and she'd done it all while dying of heart failure in a nursing home, surrounded by paid caregivers because she had no family left to sit with her. I sat in my car after that meeting, holding Dorothy's letter, and I understood something I'd been avoiding. My revenge had been satisfying in the moment, cathartic even, but it hadn't actually healed anything. I was still angry, still hurt, still carrying all those years of pain. Exposing my family hadn't freed me, it had just made the wound visible. Dorothy knew that because she'd lived it, and she'd spent her dying energy trying to give me a different path. So I made a choice. I used part of Dorothy's money to establish a foundation that helps people escape toxic family systems, providing therapy, legal support, and financial resources for people trying to rebuild their lives away from abuse and manipulation. I named it the Brennan Foundation after Dorothy, and it's helped hundreds of people in the 2 years since I started it. I still have no relationship with my parents or Victoria. Marcus and I email occasionally, and he's proven through consistent action that he's genuinely trying to change, so we meet for coffee twice a year, and we're slowly building something honest. I'm 44 now, and I live in a beautiful house that I bought with my lottery money, and I spend my days running the foundation and volunteering and traveling. And yes, Victoria was right. I am alone, but I'm not lonely. I have friends I've chosen, relationships built on honesty, and I sleep at night knowing I'm not enabling anyone's worst impulses. Was justice served in what I did to my family that Christmas? I don't know anymore. I thought so at the time, thought I was righteous and right, but Dorothy's letter made me question everything. Maybe justice isn't about exposure or revenge or making people see what they've done. Maybe justice is just refusing to participate in dysfunction anymore, walking away, and building something better with people who choose to be better. Or maybe that's not justice at all. Maybe that's just survival with better aesthetics. The truth is, I still don't have the answer. Some days I look back at that Christmas dinner and I feel proud of what I did, feel like I gave them exactly what they deserved. Other days I feel sick about it, wonder if I was just as manipulative as them in my own way, using money and information as weapons the same way they used emotions and guilt. I think about Emma sometimes, about how I involved her without telling her the full story, about how I used her trust to gather evidence against her mother, and I wonder if Dorothy would be proud of that or disappointed. I think about Victoria dealing with actual cancer while I was planning her exposure, and I tell myself she was still lying, still scamming, but I wonder if maybe I should have just helped her directly and let the past go. I think about my parents getting older, about how they'll die someday probably still believing they were the victims in all of this, and I wonder if I'll regret not trying one more time to bridge the gap. But then I think about who I was before the lottery, before Dorothy's letter, before any of this. I think about the Eleanor who worked 60-hour weeks and gave away everything she had and never asked for anything and still got blamed for every problem in the family. I think about that woman sitting alone on her 42nd birthday with a grocery store cupcake, crying because even that small acknowledgement was too much to expect, and I know that woman had to die for me to live. Maybe what I did was justice. Maybe it was revenge. Maybe it was just self-defense dressed up in dramatic revelation, but whatever it was, it freed me from a role I never auditioned for but played for 42 years. My family taught me that love was transactional, that worth was measured in utility, that asking for fairness made you the problem, and I had to burn down that entire belief system to see clearly, and if that makes me a villain in their story, I can live with that because I'm finally the hero in mine. The strangest part of all of this, the part that keeps me up some nights, is understanding that they probably genuinely don't see what they did as wrong. In my mother's mind, she raised 3 children, and of course resources had to be allocated differently based on need, and I was always fine, always capable, so why wouldn't she invest more in the children who struggled? In Victoria's mind, she was drowning and I had money and family is supposed to help family without judgment, and the fact that she lied about the reasons doesn't change the underlying truth that she needed help. In Marcus's mind, he was young and stupid and everyone makes mistakes, and I'm holding grudges over ancient history instead of moving forward. They've rewritten the narrative in their heads where they're flawed but fundamentally good people who made understandable choices, and I'm the vindictive sister who weaponized a lottery win to destroy them over petty grievances. And maybe from a certain angle, looking at it through a certain lens, their version isn't entirely wrong. Maybe the truth is that there are multiple truths, and we're all living in different stories about the same events, and no amount of evidence or exposure or revenge will ever make us see the same reality. But I'll tell you what I know for certain, what 2 years of distance in therapy and Dorothy's letter have taught me. I know that I deserve better than what they gave me. I know that loving someone doesn't obligate you to let them destroy you. I know that family isn't a free pass to use people, and blood doesn't excuse cruelty, and forgiveness isn't mandatory just because someone shares your DNA. I know that what I did that Christmas was messy and complicated and probably crossed lines I can't even see yet, but it was also necessary because I was dying in that dynamic, slowly suffocating under the weight of being the strong one, the reliable one, the one who could take it. And I know that Dorothy saw me, really saw me, across the distance and through all the years, and she used her last act on Earth to tell me I mattered, that my perception was valid, that I wasn't crazy or selfish or wrong for wanting to be treated with basic decency. That gift, that validation from a grandmother I never got to meet, was worth more than all the lottery money combined. I've thought about what I would say to them if I saw them now, if we ended up in the same room somehow and had to speak. I've rehearsed conversations in my head, imagined scenarios where they apologize or I apologize or we all just acknowledge the damage and try to move past it. But the truth is, I don't think I have anything left to say to them. I said everything that mattered that Christmas night, and what came after was just noise, just the sound of a family system collapsing under the weight of its own dysfunction. What I would say to Dorothy if I could is thank you. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for the money, but more than that, thank you for the letter. Thank you for using your pain to light a path for mine. Thank you for being honest about the cost of revenge, so I didn't have to learn it quite as hard as you did. I named my foundation after her because I wanted her name to be associated with healing instead of estrangement, with building instead of burning, and every person we help is a little bit of Dorothy getting a second chance to be the grandmother she wanted to be. There's a woman who comes to the foundation support groups sometimes, a woman in her 50s who left her family 3 years ago after a lifetime of being the scapegoat, and she told me once that the hardest part wasn't leaving, it was accepting that they'd never understand why she left. She said she kept waiting for the moment of recognition, the conversation where they'd finally see what they'd done and apologize and make it right, and she had to grieve the death of that fantasy before she could actually heal. I understood exactly what she meant, because I waited for that moment too. Even after the Christmas confrontation, even after all the evidence and exposure. I waited for my mother to call and say, "Oh my God, Eleanor, I see it now. I see what we did to you and I'm so sorry." I waited for Victoria to reach out and acknowledge that the pattern of lies was bigger than any individual incident. I waited for my father to be the parent he should have been from the beginning. And they never did, and they probably never will, And I had to bury that hope like you'd bury a loved one, with grief and ceremony and finality. Sometimes people ask me if I regret winning the lottery, if I wish I'd just stayed ignorant and maintained the family relationships, even if they were built on dysfunction. The answer is no, not even for a second, because ignorance wasn't bliss, it was slow death. I was already losing myself before the lottery, already becoming smaller and quieter and more resentful, already building walls around my heart to survive the constant disappointment. The lottery just accelerated the timeline, forced the crisis that was coming anyway, and gave me the resources to rebuild after the collapse. Without the money, I might have spent another decade or two in that pattern, giving and giving until there was nothing left, and then probably dying young from stress or health problems brought on by chronic emotional trauma, and they would have come to my funeral and said what a tragedy. She was always so strong. We had no idea she was struggling. The lottery was a detonator, but the bomb was already built, brick by brick, lie by lie, year by year of being invisible unless they needed something. I've started dating someone recently, a man named Thomas who works as a teacher and has no idea about the lottery money because I haven't told him yet. I will eventually, when I'm sure he's here for me and not for what I can provide, but for now I'm just enjoying being seen as Eleanor, not Eleanor the resource, or Eleanor the lottery winner, or Eleanor the villain who destroyed her family. He knows I run a foundation, and he thinks it's funded by grants and donations, which isn't entirely untrue, and we go on normal dates to normal restaurants and split the check, and it's the most honest relationship I've ever had. His family is kind and functional, and boring in the best possible way. And the first time I went to his parents' house for dinner, I almost cried because his mother asked me about my work and actually listened to the answer. And his father told a story about Thomas as a kid that was embarrassing but loving, and his sister teased him but not with cruelty, and I sat there thinking this is what it's supposed to be like. This is what I deserved all along. Thomas asked me once if I was close to my family, and I told him we were estranged, and he said he was sorry and didn't push for details, and I appreciated that more than I could express. Eventually I'll tell him the whole story, the lottery and the lies and the Christmas confrontation and Dorothy and all of it, and if he runs then he runs, but I don't think he will because he's demonstrated again and again that he values honesty and boundaries and reciprocity, all the things my biological family never understood. I think about the life we could build together, about maybe having children someday, and raising them in a home where love isn't conditional and help isn't transactional and family means safety instead of strategy. I think about breaking the cycle completely, about being the ancestor who stops the generational trauma in its tracks, and that feels like a worthier goal than any revenge could ever be. There are moments, though, when I miss them. Not who they actually were, but who I wanted them to be, who I kept believing they could become if I just tried hard enough, or gave enough, or proved myself enough. I miss the fantasy of having a mother who protected me, a father who saw me, a sister who celebrated me, a brother who respected me. I miss the version of my family that existed only in my hopes and never in reality, and grieving that fantasy family has been harder than grieving the real relationships, because at least with real relationships you can point to what you lost, but with fantasy relationships you're mourning something that never existed, and people don't understand why that hurts so much. My therapist says that's called ambiguous loss, the grief of losing something that was never really there, and it's one of the hardest types of grief to process because there's no closure, no funeral, no moment of finality. You just wake up one day and realize you're still waiting for people who will never arrive, and you have to choose to stop waiting, and that choice feels like betrayal, even though it's actually survival. I've thought about reaching out, about being the bigger person and extending an olive branch, about offering reconciliation on new terms with new boundaries. I've written letters I never sent, drafted emails that sit in my drafts folder, imagined conversations where I'm calm and clear and they actually hear me. But every time I get close to making contact, I remember something Dorothy wrote in her letter. She said that reconciliation is only possible when both parties acknowledge the harm and commit to change, and without that foundation, you're just rebuilding the same broken structure with prettier materials. She said she'd waited 40 years for my mother to acknowledge what she'd done, to take responsibility, to show genuine remorse and change, and it never happened, and she'd wasted decades of emotional energy on hope that was never going to materialize. She told me not to make the same mistake, not to sacrifice my peace for the illusion of family unity, and I've tried to honor that wisdom even when it's lonely. The foundation has introduced me to hundreds of people who've walked similar paths, who've had to choose between their sanity and their family, and I've learned that I'm not unique or special or even particularly damaged compared to what others have survived. There are people who've escaped families that make mine look functional, people who've been beaten and abandoned and gaslit to the point of questioning their own reality, and they're rebuilding their lives with courage and grace and humor, and they remind me that trauma isn't a competition and healing isn't linear, and there's no right way to survive a family that wasn't safe. We have a saying at the foundation, something one of the members coined during a group session, and we've put it on t-shirts and mugs and posters. It says, "The family you need is waiting, but first you have to leave the family you have." It sounds harsh written out like that. Sounds like we're encouraging people to abandon their families, but what it really means is that sometimes you have to create distance from toxicity before you can find or build healthy connections. And that's not abandonment. That's self-preservation that I think about legacy sometimes, about what I'll leave behind when I'm gone. My biological family would have said my legacy was being the responsible one, the helper, the solution to other people's problems, and I would have died having never lived for myself. Now my legacy will be the foundation, the hundreds or thousands of people who find safety and support and validation through Dorothy's money and my experience, and that feels like alchemy, like turning pain into purpose, like making meaning out of the meaningless cruelty of dysfunctional family systems. I think Dorothy would approve, think she'd be proud of what I built from the ruins of what we both lost, and sometimes when I'm working late at the foundation office, reviewing grant applications or planning support groups, I swear I can feel her presence, not in a supernatural way, but in the sense that her values and her wisdom live on through the work, and that's as close to immortality as any of us get. Would I do it differently if I could go back? Would I handle the Christmas confrontation with more grace, less drama, more compassion for the complexity of human motivation? I don't know. Maybe. Probably. But I also know that the version of me who walked into that house on Christmas Eve was operating with incomplete information, was still raw from years of accumulated hurt, was still believing on some level that exposure would lead to recognition and recognition would lead to change. I didn't have Dorothy's letter yet. Didn't have her 40 years of perspective. Didn't understand that revenge is a meal that fills you up in the moment but leaves you hungry an hour later. I did the best I could with the emotional tools I had available, and that has to be enough, because I can't go back and I wouldn't want to even if I could, because going back would mean unlearning everything I've learned about boundaries and self-worth and the difference between being alone and being lonely. The last time I drove past my parents' house, it was late at night, and I was coming back from a foundation event in the old neighborhood. I didn't plan to go that way, but I took a wrong turn and suddenly I was on their street, and I slowed down without meaning to, and I looked at the house where I grew up, where I learned all the wrong lessons about love and worth and family. The lights were on in the living room, and I could see shadows moving behind the curtains, and I wondered who they were now, who they'd become in the 2 years since I'd seen them. Had they learned anything? Had they grown? Had they developed the capacity for self-reflection and accountability, or were they still telling themselves stories where they were the victims and I was the villain? I'll probably never know, and I've made peace with that uncertainty, or at least I'm trying to make peace with it, or at least I'm learning to live with a lack of peace, which maybe is the same thing in the end. I kept driving that night, past the house and the memories and the ghosts of who I used to be, and I went home to my beautiful house that I bought with lottery money that no one knows about except my lawyer and my accountant and now Thomas, who I told last week because I decided I trusted him and I was tired of hiding. He didn't care about the money, didn't treat me differently, just asked if I was okay and listened while I told him the whole story. And when I finished, he said that what I did took courage, and what I'm doing now takes even more courage. And I wasn't sure if I agreed, but I appreciated him saying it. We're talking about moving in together, about building a life that's completely separate from my past, and I'm terrified and excited in equal measure because I've never had a healthy relationship before and I don't entirely trust that I'll recognize one even when I'm living it. If this story left you speechless, smash that like button right now. Tell me in the comments, was justice served or did I go too far? And don't forget to subscribe, you won't want to miss next week's chilling confession.